Welcome back, everyone. Tonight I've collected some of the darkest and most haunting tales I've shared with you. This compilation will take you on a journey through the eerie, the unknown, and the terrifying. Whether you've heard these stories before or you're experiencing them for the first time, each one will pull you deeper into the shadows. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a descent into some of the most unsettling tales I've told. If you enjoy the ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's begin. Fragments of Forever. I don't remember when the sun stopped rising on time. I could have sworn it was yesterday, but that doesn't mean anything anymore. Here, nothing means anything. When it all started, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been working long hours, barely sleeping. It wasn't unusual to lose track of time. Days would bleed into nights without me even noticing. But this was different. It was mid-afternoon when I glanced at the clock on my desk. 2:47 p.m. or so, I thought. 5 minutes later, I checked again, and it still said 2:47. My phone had the same time. I reset it, thinking it was frozen, but nothing changed. Hours went by and the minute hand didn't budge. I stepped outside for some fresh air, and that's when I saw the sky. It was caught in a golden hue, frozen in the magic hour, when the sun hovers just above the horizon, casting long shadows that never fade. At first, it was beautiful, a perpetual sunset, but after a while, it felt oppressive. I went back inside, hoping it was a glitch, something that would sort itself out. But it didn't. For days, or maybe weeks, time remained stuck. Every clock I owned, every electronic device refused to move past that moment. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Then I started seeing the people. They weren't ghosts, at least not in the way you'd imagine. They looked real, as if plucked straight out of everyday life. But something was off. They appeared, flickering in and out of existence, carrying on with their tasks in endless loops, like actors stuck in a scene they couldn't escape. There was the woman in the red coat who always stood at the corner of my street, glancing at her watch. Every 10 seconds, she'd check the time, look up, and frown, as if waiting for someone. A couple sat at a cafe, laughing and drinking coffee that never seemed to cool. A man in a business suit would walk past my apartment at exactly 7:15 p.m. every evening, even though the sun never set. It wasn't just them. I felt it too. I'd go about my day, only to realize I'd done the exact same thing the day before. Every conversation, every gesture, replayed with unnerving precision. If I deviated from the routine, the world around me would correct itself. If I didn't follow my usual route home from work, the streets would twist and bend until I found myself back where I was supposed to be, always in that same eternal twilight. I tried talking to the others, but they wouldn't respond. It was like they couldn't see me. I waved my hand in front of the man in the suit. Nothing. It was as if I wasn't there, or worse, they weren't. One night, or what I assumed was night, I saw something change. It was subtle, a ripple in the fabric of the world. The man in the suit stopped, just for a second. He glanced over his shoulder as if someone had called his name. I froze, not daring to breathe. Then just as quickly he resumed walking, the moment forgotten. But it gave me hope. If he could break free, maybe I could too. I began testing the boundaries. I'd repeat the same action over and over, hoping to create a fracture in the routine. One evening, I grabbed a cup of coffee from the cafe where the couple sat. They didn't notice, of course. The coffee was hot, too hot, and it burned my hand, but I forced myself to hold on to it. I took a sip, willing the taste to pull me back into reality. For a brief moment, I thought it worked. The sky dimmed, the streetlights flickered on. But then the world snapped back and I was stuck in the same endless dusk. Then came the whispers. It started as a low hum, something just at the edge of hearing, barely perceptible. Over time, it grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words. "You don't belong here." The voices came from everywhere and nowhere. They whispered in my ear when I slept, muttered behind me as I walked. But every time I turned around, No one was there. "You don't belong here." That's when I realized neither did they. I began to suspect that this world wasn't real, or rather it was real, but not in the way I understood. The people around me weren't alive. They were echoes, trapped in their own cycles, repeating the same actions over and over, bound to a specific moment in time. And I was no different. My moment came back to me in flashes. An accident, the sound of screeching tires, glass shattering, my body weightless as I hurtled through the air. That was my last memory before I woke up in this place. Was this purgatory? A limbo between life and death? Or was it worse? I tried to leave. I packed a bag and drove as far as the roads would take me. But no matter where I went, I always ended up back at my apartment, staring at the unmoving clock, caught in the same moment. It's been months, years, since I stopped trying. The sun still hangs in the sky, casting its eternal glow, and the people continue their mindless routines. I've learned to accept it, even as the whispers grow louder. You don't belong here, but maybe I do. Maybe I always did. The static. I used to think nothing could ever surprise me. After all, I worked as a night technician at a small local broadcasting station. Graveyard shifts, a few dials, fixing glitches, easy work. I had spent years sitting in front of silent machines, basking in the dim glow of endless screens. But one night, everything changed. It started as a regular Tuesday night. The station was dead quiet as always, with only a handful of pre-recorded shows airing. I settled into my chair, prepared to spend another night battling sleep and watching old forgotten programs loop into oblivion. That's when the interference started. At first it was subtle, just a flicker on one of the monitors. Nothing new, just the kind of static that happens on an old transmission. I adjusted the frequency and watched as the screen returned to normal. But then it happened again. Another flicker, and this time something appeared in the static. A shape, just for a split second. But I saw it. A figure. I leaned in, rewinding the footage. The static burst. The shape came, and it was gone again. I paused it right on the frame where the shape had appeared. It was blurry, hard to make out, but it looked like a person, someone tall and slender, standing still amidst the black and white haze. But there was no show airing that matched that image. In fact, the channel was supposed to be off air. Strange, I thought. Maybe a signal bleed from another channel? I brushed it off and moved on, keeping the frequency clear. But as the hours dragged on, the flickering grew worse. Every few minutes, static would flood the screens, not just one, but all of them. A cacophony of white noise. And that figure, the shape in the static, it kept appearing. Except now, it was clearer, closer. At first, I laughed it off. Told myself I was tired, maybe seeing things. But by 2 a.m., it wasn't funny anymore. The figure had become unmistakable. A man, his outline sharp, but his features still blurred by the static. His head was tilted slightly, like he was staring at something off camera. Every time he appeared, he was a little closer to the screen. But the worst part wasn't the figure itself. It was what happened when he appeared. The room grew cold, a kind of damp, suffocating cold that seeped through the walls. My breath would catch, and the hum of the station's machines became distant, like they were underwater. Then, as suddenly as the figure appeared, the cold would vanish and the room returned to normal. I checked the equipment. Everything seemed fine. No signal bleed, no malfunction. But the static kept coming. Every time I adjusted the frequency, every time I cleared the interference, the man returned. Closer. Always closer. It got to the point where I started keeping the lights on in the booth, afraid of the dark pressing in through the windows. There was no one else in the building, just me and the machines, and the man who lived in the static. At 3:30 a.m., something changed. The static hit again, this time harder. The sound of it rattled the speakers, a harsh crackling that filled the room. I scrambled to fix it, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't go away. All the screens filled with static, but the man was gone. I stared at the monitors, a knot forming in my stomach. For the first time that night, I realized I didn't want to see what happened next. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Not on the screen, behind me. I froze. My hand hovered over the controls as the cold enveloped the room again, thicker this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Slowly, I turned my head. There, in the reflection of the control room window, I saw him. The man from the static. He was standing in the booth with me just a few feet behind my chair. His features were still vague, like a shadow made of television snow. His head tilted the same way it had been on the screens. But now, he was here. Outside the static. In the room. In my world. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but the booth was empty. My pulse thundered in my ears. I turned back to the screens, praying for the static to clear. The sound continued to hiss and crackle, louder than before, but the man wasn't on the monitors anymore. I glanced at the window again, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The reflection was clear. He was closer. No, not closer. He was right behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in a terror I had never known. Slowly, I felt it. The cold sensation of something brushing against my neck. Not a hand. No, it was the static itself. It was crawling up my skin, sinking into me, filling me with that same distorted crackle. I bolted from the booth, not bothering to shut down the equipment. I ran down the empty hallway, the flickering lights overhead casting shadows that twisted in the corners of my vision. When I reached the exit, I slammed through the doors and stumbled into the parking lot. The station loomed behind me, silent except for the faint echo of static in my ears. My car was parked just a few feet away, but I didn't move. I stood there, staring at the building, half expecting the man to appear in the doorway, waiting. I never went back to that station. They say the late-night static is just interference, a glitch in the signal. But I know the truth. There's something living in those frequencies, something watching. And once it sees you, it doesn't let go. The hands of time. The day I stumbled upon the old clockmaker's shop, it felt like the world had paused. The clouds hung like paintings in the sky, and the city's usual rhythm of life seemed eerily out of sync. The quaint, ivy-clad building looked out of place, wedged between two towering modern structures. Its wood-paneled exterior and fogged windows beckoned with an antiquated charm, as if time itself had forgotten this little pocket of the world. I didn't know what pulled me toward it, but the urge was irresistible. The bells above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside. A myriad of clocks lined the walls, their ticking creating an oddly comforting hum. Some clocks were grand, almost regal in stature, with ornate designs and gilded details. Others were small, with simple faces and quiet ticks, the kind you'd imagine on a mantelpiece in someone's grandparents' house. Yet, despite the hundreds of clocks in the room, none of them struck the hour. Behind the counter, a man stood with his back to me. His silhouette was hunched, hands busy at work with the delicate gears of a pocket watch. The workshop smelled of varnished wood and brass. I cleared my throat softly, not wanting to startle him, but his raspy voice spoke before I had a chance to greet him. "I wondered when you'd arrive," he said without turning. A shiver traced my spine. "You knew I was coming?" He chuckled, a low, dry sound that reminded me of the creak of old wood. "I know the time of everyone who enters my shop." I frowned, the discomfort creeping in more now. "The time?" "Their time," he clarified, finally turning to face me. His eyes were pale, nearly white, with a glint that spoke of wisdom beyond the ordinary. His face was aged, skin crisscrossed with wrinkles that seemed etched by centuries of care. "How much time they have left?" I let out a nervous laugh. "That's a bit of an odd thing to say, don't you think?" "Is it?" His eyes didn't leave mine. You'd be surprised how little time most people have, even those who think they have forever. I glanced around the shop, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Your clocks. None of them seem to be working. He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. They only work when someone's time is measured. I forced a smile, but his words dug into my mind. What do you mean? He stepped forward, his bony hand gesturing toward a large antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Its face was dark, the hands frozen in place. That clock belongs to you. To me? Yes. It's been waiting for your arrival. My heart skipped a beat. The whole atmosphere of the shop began to shift, as if the air had thickened. I could hear my pulse, the sound of my own breath becoming loud in my ears. This is a joke, right? The clockmaker's lips barely moved as he whispered, "Time waits for no one." I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. The grandfather clock loomed large in the corner of the room, and to my horror, the hands began to move, but not forward. They were spinning backward. At first they ticked slowly, but then they gained speed, whirring around the face of the clock with impossible urgency. I reached out to steady myself against a nearby counter, feeling the room tilt around me. What's happening? The clockmaker's gaze never wavered. You've been living on borrowed time, he said calmly. But time always finds a way to collect its debts. I couldn't breathe. His words hit me like ice water. Borrowed time? The phrase echoed in my head. I remembered the childhood accident, when I had fallen into the icy river and nearly drowned, only to be pulled out just in time. Then the car accident a few years ago that I had walked away from with barely a scratch, despite the vehicle being totaled. And that choking incident in the restaurant where I'd felt the world darken at the edges before someone intervened. Moments of near death that I had written off as luck. No, this isn't real, I stammered. This can't be happening. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, as if the shop itself was echoing my impending fate. The air around me felt thick, heavy, like something was pulling me toward an invisible force. The ticking wasn't just in the air, it was inside my head. There are moments we're not meant to survive, the clockmaker continued. Some cheat time, whether by accident or design. But those moments, they always catch up. I backed away, my body feeling sluggish, as though time itself was slowing me down. I'm not dying, I managed, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed the words. The clock's hand spun faster, a blur of motion, ticking toward some unseen point of no return. The noise was deafening now, each tick reverberating in my bones. My limbs felt heavy, and with each passing second, I felt weaker. You can't escape time, he whispered, stepping closer. But you can delay it. You can bargain. The word hung in the air like a lifeline. I grabbed it. Bargain? He smiled, cold and sharp, and reached into his vest pocket. From it, he withdrew a small silver pocket watch, its surface smooth and polished to a perfect gleam. I give you time, he said softly. A little more. But you give me something in return. My gaze flickered to the watch. The hands on its face were still, frozen at midnight, but it pulsed in his hand, as though alive with the seconds it held captive. Desperation clawed at my throat. What do you want from me? Time, he said simply. Yours, to be exact. A little piece of it, just enough to keep you going. I stared at him, the ticking of the clocks like a heartbeat in my ears. What was he asking for? My life in exchange for a few more moments? The weight of his words pressed down on me, but I had no choice. I could feel the threads of time unraveling around me, pulling me toward an end I wasn't ready to meet. With trembling hands, I reached out. What do I have to do? He placed the pocket watch in my palm, his touch as cold as death itself. Make your choice, he whispered. The air in the shop grew still. My breath hitched, the ticking fading into a distant murmur as I clutched the watch. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my decision. I closed my eyes, squeezing the watch tight. "Fine," I whispered. "I'll take the deal." A sudden silence fell over the shop. The ticking stopped, and the weight that had been pressing down on me lifted. My limbs felt lighter. My breath came easier. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The clocks on the walls had returned to their frozen state. The grandfather clock stood still in the corner, its hands motionless. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but something felt off. The clockmaker stepped back, his pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You've bought yourself some time," he said. "But remember, every second is borrowed, and one day time will come to collect." I left the shop in a daze, the silver pocket watch heavy in my hand. As I stepped outside, the world resumed its usual pace. People hurried past me, cars honked in the distance, and the sky seemed brighter, more vibrant, but the sense of dread lingered. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the watch. I placed it on my nightstand, its still face reflecting the moonlight. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I had more time, that the deal was done, but deep down, I knew better. Days passed. The watch never ticked, but I began to notice changes. I moved slower. My body felt heavier. People who passed me on the street seemed to blur at the edges, as though they existed on a plane I was slipping away from. And then one evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I heard it, the ticking. At first, it was faint, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. I looked around, searching for the source, but the clocks on the walls were silent. The sound came from the pocket watch. I picked it up, and to my horror, the hands were moving. Slowly, methodically, they ticked forward. Tick, tock. Time was running out. The hands beneath the stars. I've always had trouble sleeping. For as long as I can remember, I'd lie awake at night, staring at my ceiling, waiting for that elusive moment when exhaustion finally overpowers my restless mind. But it rarely ever did. When you're an insomniac, you learn to fill the endless hours somehow. For me, that meant staring out the window. It was something I started doing out of boredom, but it soon became a ritual. My room, perched on the second floor, gave me the perfect view of the night sky, an infinite stretch of black dotted with tiny pinpricks of light. There was something peaceful about it. At least there used to be. I didn't notice it right away. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible. But after months of staring at the same patch of sky, you get familiar with the details. I knew where each star should be, the way the constellations shifted across the night. So when the stars began to vanish, I noticed. At first, it was only a few. I chalked it up to clouds or light pollution from the nearby town, even though it wasn't unusual for me to see them clearly. But as the nights wore on, the gaps in the sky grew larger. Stars that had once been a constant presence in my window were swallowed by darkness. The worst part? It wasn't just an empty void where they used to be. No, the void itself moved. Slowly, deliberately, like something alive. I told myself I was imagining things. Insomnia does strange things to your brain, after all. Maybe I was just tired, too tired to think straight. But each night the void grew wider, spreading across the heavens like black ink soaking through fabric. And then one night I realized what I was really seeing. They weren't gaps at all, they were shapes. Fingers. Long, spindly fingers that stretched across the sky, their inky blackness blotting out the stars. And each night, they seemed to grow longer, reaching further toward the horizon. The realization made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. The fingers, if that's what they were moving. Slowly, yes, but they were undeniably inching their way toward me. I couldn't unsee it. Weeks passed. My nightly stargazing had turned into something else, a morbid kind of obsession. I couldn't stop looking. I had to know how far they'd come, how much closer they'd gotten. By now, the fingers spanned half the sky, And worse, I'd begun to notice something in the spaces between them. Eyes. At first they were faint, almost too dim to see, but the more I watched, the clearer they became. Eyes, dozens of them, staring down from the spaces between those black, twisted fingers. They blinked, they shifted, and sometimes they locked onto mine. I remember the first time I felt that connection, the sense of being seen, truly seen. My whole body went cold, my breath caught in my throat, and I swear, in that moment, the fingers moved faster. I knew it was crazy, I knew no one would believe me, but it was real. I started taking pictures with my phone, trying to capture what I saw. But no matter how clear the image in my mind, the photos always came out blurry, distorted, just a black smudge where the sky should be. I tried video too, but the result was the same. It was as if whatever was up there didn't want to be captured. Still, I couldn't stop watching. One night, about a month after I first saw the fingers, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I grabbed my camera, a decent DSLR, and set it up on a tripod by the window. I was determined to get a clear shot. If no one would believe me, I'd at least have proof for myself. I zoomed in as far as I could, focusing on the area where the fingers were most visible, and for the first time, I saw them up close. The void between the stars wasn't just darkness. It was alive. The fingers weren't fingers at all, not in the human sense. They were tendrils, maybe? Massive cosmic limbs made of some kind of shadowy substance that seemed to absorb all light. And the eyes. Oh God, the eyes. There were so many of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds. All different sizes. Some blinking slowly, others wide open, staring with an intensity that made my stomach churn. They weren't just watching the world, they were watching me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands froze on the camera, my breath stuck in my throat. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that the fingers were moving faster now. They were getting closer. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that impossible scene. Minutes? Hours? But eventually something broke through my paralysis, and I stumbled back, knocking over the tripod in the process. The camera hit the floor with a heavy thud, the lens cracking on impact. But even then, I couldn't look away from the window. The fingers were still there, reaching, stretching, as if they knew I was watching. And then, they stopped. For the first time in weeks, the fingers stopped moving. The eyes blinked, almost in unison, and the entire mass of shadow seemed to pause, waiting, watching. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my blood rushing in my ears. I stepped back, away from the window, and pulled the curtains shut as fast as I could. I should have stopped there. I should have walked away. But the fear was overwhelming. I needed to know if the camera had captured what I'd seen. I picked it up, hands trembling, and flipped through the footage. Nothing. Static. Just like before. I wanted to scream. How could something so real, so vivid, leave no trace? Was I going mad? The rational part of my brain was desperately trying to take control, to explain everything away. But the rest of me knew the truth. The fingers were real, the eyes were real, and they were getting closer. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of my room, eyes fixed on the window, half expecting the fingers to tear through the glass at any moment. But they didn't. The night passed, and when morning came, everything felt normal again. The sun rose, the birds chirped, and for a brief, blissful moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a dream. Almost. I didn't open the curtains for 3 days after that, but it didn't matter. I could feel them out there. They were waiting. I could hear the faint sound of scratching at night like nails on glass, growing louder with each passing hour. They knew I'd seen them. They knew I was afraid. On the 4th night, I made the mistake of looking again. The sky was gone. Where the stars and the moon should have been, there was only darkness. The fingers had reached the window, their long, spindly tendrils pressed against the glass, as if testing the barrier between us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. Then one of the fingers tapped, and it was a gentle sound. Just a single tap, like someone knocking politely. But it reverberated through me like a thunderclap. The world stood still. I staggered back, heart racing, and slammed the curtains shut. The tapping stopped. Silence. That was weeks ago. I haven't slept since. I'm afraid to. I keep the curtains shut, but I can still hear them. The scratching, the tapping. Sometimes I swear I can see the blackness seeping through the cracks in the walls, creeping closer. I can't leave the house, I can't even leave my room. Every night they get closer, and every night I know the truth a little more clearly. The hands, those massive cosmic fingers, they've noticed me. They're waiting for me, and soon they'll reach me. I just hope you don't look up at the sky, because once you see them, they see you too. The sound of silence. We didn't know the world had gone quiet until it was too late. It started small. One by one, people stopped talking. At first, we thought they had just grown tired of the noise, the constant buzz of the modern world, filled with notifications, endless chatter, and the hum of life. But soon it became clear that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just people choosing silence. They were being consumed by it. I first noticed it with my neighbor, old Mr. Wallace. He was always the kind to strike up conversation whenever I passed him on my way to work. He had one of those weathered faces that always seemed to smile even when he wasn't. Every morning without fail, he'd be out on his porch waving and calling out, "Morning, kiddo." But then, one day, he wasn't. He was sitting there, same as always, but he didn't wave, didn't call out. His lips moved like he was speaking, but no sound came out. I thought he was maybe hoarse or playing a joke, so I waved and kept walking. The next day was the same, and the day after that. His mouth moved, but no sound. Just silence. I told myself it was just old age catching up with him. Still, something about it unsettled me. The way his eyes looked, blank, unfocused, like he wasn't really there. The image lingered in my mind as I walked to work, nagging at the back of my thoughts, but I pushed it away. I had bigger things to worry about. But then it started happening everywhere. At first, it was just a few people in the streets. A couple on the bus, their mouths moving silently as if engaged in a deep conversation, oblivious to the fact that no sound was coming out. A cashier at the local supermarket mouthing, "Have a nice day," with nothing but the dead air hanging between us. Each time it happened, my skin prickled, but no one else seemed to notice or care. People carried on, as if they'd grown used to it, as if silence was a normal part of their lives now. Then one day my boss stopped talking. It was in the middle of a staff meeting. We were discussing the quarterly report, and he was his usual animated self, pointing at charts, talking about projections, when suddenly his voice just vanished. His lips moved, but there was nothing. Not even the shuffling of papers or the rustle of clothes. The entire room went eerily still, as if the sound had been sucked out of the air. My coworkers sat there, nodding along like nothing had happened, their faces blank and oblivious. I glanced around, expecting someone to react, to say something, but no one did. It was as if the silence had taken them too. A cold dread settled in my chest. I raised my hand, my voice trembling as I asked, "Does anyone else hear that?" But no one even looked my way. They all just stared straight ahead, like they hadn't heard a word I'd said. My boss kept speaking silently, pointing at his charts, his lips moving in a soundless lecture. It felt like a dream, like I was trapped in some strange, mute world where I was the only one who could hear nothing. After the meeting, I confronted my boss. I wanted to ask if he was okay, if he knew what was happening, but when I reached his office, the door was locked. Through the small window, I could see him sitting at his desk, staring straight ahead, his lips moving silently, endlessly. I knocked, harder and harder, but he didn't react. The next morning, he didn't show up to work. No one mentioned it. It was as if he'd never existed. That evening, I met up with my friend Sarah. She hadn't been affected by the silence, and I clung to that like a lifeline. As we sat down at our usual cafe, I noticed how quiet the place was. The kind of quiet that crawls under your skin. "Have you noticed how weird everything's been lately?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Sarah looked up from her coffee, her brow furrowing. "Weird how?" "I don't know. Like, people are just quiet. Like they've forgotten how to talk." Sarah blinked, then laughed, but it wasn't her usual laugh. It was forced, awkward. "You're overthinking it. People are probably just tired or something. You know how the city is. Everyone's always exhausted." I nodded, though I didn't feel reassured. "Yeah, maybe. I just feel like something's off. Like they're not just tired, they're..." I trailed off, struggling to find the right word. "Missing." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You need a vacation." I wanted to argue, but then I noticed something strange. Sarah's smile lingered for too long. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but nothing came out. She stared at me, her mouth moving in slow, deliberate motions, forming words that I couldn't hear. My heart raced. "Sarah?" I leaned in, trying to catch even a whisper, but there was nothing. She kept mouthing words, oblivious to the silence that had swallowed her. I stood up abruptly, knocking my coffee over, the liquid spreading across the table. "Sarah!" She didn't react. She just sat there, moving her mouth in endless, soundless conversation. It was like she didn't even realize she wasn't speaking anymore. I stumbled out of the cafe, my pulse pounding in my ears. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't just that people had stopped talking. There were no footsteps, no cars, no wind rustling through the trees. Nothing. It was as if the world itself had been muted. Panicking, I rushed home and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but when I dialed, there was no ringtone, not even the dull hum of the line connecting. I threw the phone down, my breathing shallow and fast. This wasn't just happening to other people, it was spreading. Then the silence deepened. It's hard to explain, but the quiet wasn't just an absence of sound anymore. It had weight, pressure. It pressed against my skin, my skull, my thoughts. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but that only made it worse. I could feel the silence creeping, seeping into my bones. A whisper of static crackled in my mind, like the noise that used to fill old radios when they couldn't find a station. Faint at first, but growing louder. And then, through the static, I heard it. A voice. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside me. "Join us." I froze. My hands trembled as I clutched the sides of my head, desperate to drown out the noise. But the voice kept repeating. It was faint, but clear, impossibly clear. "Join us in the silence." I screamed, but my own voice came out as nothing more than a breath. A shadow of sound. I ran to the mirror, staring at my reflection, my mouth hanging open in silent terror. My lips moved, forming words, but they didn't reach my ears. I slapped my hand against the wall, desperate to make noise, but the impact was dull, lifeless. That's when I understood. The silence wasn't just taking people's voices, it was consuming them. One by one, people were being pulled into a world of endless quiet, swallowed by something that lurked in the absence of sound. And once it took your voice, it took you. I backed away from the mirror, but it was too late. The static grew louder in my mind, and the voice returned. "Join us." This time, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. The room around me seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was bending. The silence became thick, suffocating. I tried to scream again, but the sound wouldn't come. The voice inside my head was louder now, drowning out all thought. "Join us." I clutched at my ears, desperate for anything, any noise. But all I could hear was the static in that voice. Then something shifted. The world around me faded, and I was no longer in my apartment. I was standing in a vast, endless space, gray and empty, stretching out in all directions. The silence here was absolute. Not just quiet, but the absence of life, of existence. And in the distance I saw them, the others, people, their mouths moving silently, aimlessly wandering in the void. And I knew, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that I was one of them now. There was no escape from the silence, no way back. "Join us," the voice whispered one last time, and I could feel myself slipping away, my thoughts dissolving into the static, my voice swallowed by the endless, consuming quiet. Echoes in the rain. It started with the rain. Not a normal stormy downpour, but a slow, whispering drizzle that seemed to hang in the air, never quite touching the ground. I noticed it one evening when I stepped out of work, pulling my jacket tightly around me. The rain wasn't falling like it should. It was just there, hovering mid-air, droplets suspended in some strange, invisible tension. People walked by as if they didn't notice anything unusual, their umbrellas up, their heads down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rain was whispering. I stood under the street lamp, watching the misty drizzle drift around me, and strained my ears. It was faint, so faint I thought I might have imagined it at first, but the whispers were unmistakable. Soft, like a voice carried through water. It wasn't coming from anyone around me. It was coming from the rain itself. I tried to shake it off. I mean, who hears whispers in the rain? Maybe I was tired, overworked. The long hours at the office had been wearing me down, and I hadn't slept well in days. But the further I walked, the louder the whispers became. They sounded disjointed, fragmented, like someone trying to speak through a layer of static. By the time I reached the subway, I couldn't take it anymore. I paused at the entrance, staring at the shimmering curtain of rain just beyond the roof of the platform. It was still hanging there, weightless. The drops caught in the air like they were waiting for something unseen to pull them down. I was transfixed. For a second, I thought I could make out words, just fragments, shifting through the whispers. They were soft, indistinct. "Don't forget!" "Remember the sound." The air felt heavy, thicker than usual. I had the strangest urge to reach out, to stick my hand into the suspended droplets and feel them on my skin. My fingers hovered just inches away when a hand suddenly clapped down on my shoulder. I jumped, spinning around. It was a woman, an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with sharp green eyes that seemed to bore right into me. Her gray hair was plastered to her scalp, and she was soaked to the bone, though she didn't seem to notice. Her clothes clung to her, her shoes muddy, as if she had walked miles in the storm. "You heard it, didn't you?" she said, her voice low and hurried. "What?" I stammered, glancing at the rain again. "The rain," she said, her eyes flicking toward the drizzle. "It's whispering to you." I opened my mouth to respond, but didn't know what to say. Was she hearing it too? "You need to come with me," she said urgently, tugging at my arm. "Before it gets worse. Before the voices get louder." I should have walked away, called her crazy. But something about her and the way the rain seemed to hum in agreement with her words sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I let her lead me out of the subway station and into the dark streets. We didn't talk much as she hurried me down winding alleys and deserted roads, far from the city's bustle. The rain was everywhere, clinging to us, sticking to our skin like static. I felt it pressing into my head, pushing its whispers into my mind. The woman seemed to know where she was going, though, and I followed her through the maze of streets until we reached a small, dilapidated building tucked away behind an overgrown lot. She unlocked the door with shaky hands and practically shoved me inside. It was an old shop, or at least it had been once. The windows were grimy, and shelves of dust-covered trinkets lined the walls. Candles flickered in the corners, casting eerie shadows over everything. "Close the door," the woman snapped, peering nervously out into the rain. I did as she said, shutting out the whispering drizzle. For a moment, the silence was deafening. She exhaled slowly and turned to me, wiping water from her face. "We're safe here." "Safe from what?" I asked, my voice thick with confusion and fear. "What the hell is going on?" "The rain," she said, pacing across the room. "It isn't normal. It hasn't been normal for years." I stared at her, unsure whether I had just made the biggest mistake of my life by following her here. "What do you mean, not normal?" "It's just rain." She stopped pacing and fixed me with a sharp glare. "No, not just rain. The whispers. You heard them, didn't you?" I swallowed. I thought I did." "Thought?" She snorted. "You wouldn't be here if you hadn't heard them. The rain. It speaks to those who listen, but it doesn't speak with words. It's not like anything you've heard before." I rubbed my forehead, trying to wrap my mind around what she was saying. "What are you talking about? Why would rain whisper?" She sat down across from me, leaning in as if she were about to tell me a secret. "The rain is haunted," she said. "Not by spirits or ghosts, but by something older, something deeper." I stared at her, waiting for more, but she seemed to struggle with how to explain. After a moment, she sighed and reached into her coat pocket, pulling out an old, tattered journal. She slid it across the table to me. "This will explain better than I can." I picked up the journal, flipping through its yellowed pages. The handwriting was cramped and rushed, notes scribbled in the margins, diagrams I didn't recognize. One phrase kept repeating on nearly every page. "The voices are in the rain." "There are others," the woman said quietly as I skimmed the pages. "Others like you. People who've heard the whispers." "Who wrote this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "My brother," she said, her eyes glazing over with memories. "He was one of the first, back before anyone knew what the rain was." I looked up at her. "What happened to him?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window. The rain pattered softly against the glass, but inside, the air felt thick and still. "He went looking for answers," she said finally. "He thought he could find the source of the voices, that maybe if he understood them, he could stop them." I frowned. "Stop them from what?" "From taking him." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, taking him?" She leaned forward, her voice low and trembling. "The rain doesn't just whisper. It calls. And if you listen too long, if you let it in, it takes you." I swallowed, glancing back at the journal in my hands. "Takes you where?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "No one knows. But they disappear. Everyone who listens too long. They vanish into the rain." I put the journal down, my heart pounding. "So what? You're telling me your brother disappeared because he listened to the rain?" She nodded, her expression grim. "Not just him, others too. It's happening more and more now. The whispers are spreading. It's getting louder." I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to shake off the creeping dread that was settling in. "Why me? Why am I hearing it?" "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some people are just sensitive. Maybe you're one of them. But once you hear it, once you notice it, it doesn't stop." The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. I could hear the rain outside, still whispering faintly, its soft voice pushing against the walls. "How do I stop it?" I asked, my throat tight. "How do I make it go away?" The woman looked away, her expression dark. "There is no stopping it. Once the rain finds you, it keeps calling. All you can do is drown out the noise, try to block it out. But even then, the silence is only temporary." For the next few days, I did everything I could to avoid the rain. I stayed inside, keeping my windows shut, my headphones in at all times, playing music or podcasts at full volume. But even with the distraction, I could still feel the whispers pressing at the edges of my mind, like a distant echo, growing louder with each passing day. I didn't see the woman again. After that night in the shop, she vanished. No phone number, no address. I tried to find her, to get more answers, but it was as if she had never existed. Then the rain came again, heavier this time, relentless, and the whispers were back, stronger than ever. I could hear them through my headphones, even when I cranked the volume up as high as it would go. The rain was inside my head now, pushing, whispering, beckoning. Come closer, listen, remember. I stayed locked inside my apartment, curtains drawn, hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The rain was all I could hear. Even in my dreams, it was there, whispering softly, pulling me towards something I couldn't understand. One night, after hours of fighting it, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to find out what it wanted. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside into the downpour. The rain hit me like a wall of sound, the whispers roaring in my ears now, drowning out everything else. I stumbled down the street, soaked to the bone, but I didn't care. The rain was calling me, and I had to follow it. It led me to the outskirts of town, to a place I had never been before. A stretch of forest, dense and overgrown, where the trees seemed to bend and sway in the wind. The whispers were so loud now, I could barely think, but I pressed on, deeper into the woods. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of an old, crumbling well. The stones were slick with moss, and the air around it felt colder than the rest of the forest. The rain seemed to gather around the well, swirling above it like a cloud of mist. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness below. The whispers were coming from the well now, echoing up from its depths, calling me down. Remember, find us. We are waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt at the edge of the well, staring into the abyss. The whispers were so loud, so clear now, that they felt like my own thoughts. I couldn't tell where the rain ended and I began. Then, something moved. A vague, shadowy figure from the darkness below. Its form was made of the rain itself, dripping and shifting as it climbed out of the well. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the figure turned its gaze toward me. It had no face, no features, just a shifting, formless mass of water. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The whispers surged, louder than ever. Join us! The figure reached out, its hand dripping with rain, and I felt something inside me break. The whispers filled my mind, consuming every thought, every memory. I couldn't resist anymore. The rain was in me now. The last thing I remember is the cold touch of the rain against my skin and the sound of the whispers, fading into silence. The itch. When it first started, it felt like nothing more than a mosquito bite. I was at my desk at work, deep in a spreadsheet, when I felt the first itch on the back of my left shoulder. It was one of those itches that creeps up slowly, teasing at first, then intensifying until you have no choice but to scratch. So I reached around and absent-mindedly scratched it, thinking nothing of it. It went away, as most itches do. But over the next few days it came back. Always in the same spot, just beneath my left shoulder blade. A nagging little tingle that begged to be scratched. It wasn't painful, just annoying. I chalked it up to dry skin, or maybe a little bug bite I'd missed. A week passed and I still couldn't shake the itch. It would come and go at random times, growing more persistent each day. By the end of the second week, I found myself reaching over my shoulder to scratch it almost every hour, the irritation like a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. I tried all the obvious things: lotion, antihistamines, even some weird home remedies my coworker Angela suggested, like rubbing garlic on the skin. Nothing worked. And then something changed. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt it again, stronger, almost burning. I scratched at it in the dark, but my fingers couldn't seem to find the right spot. No matter how hard I tried, The itch stayed just out of reach. Frustrated, I stumbled out of bed, fumbled into the bathroom, and looked over my shoulder in the mirror, hoping I might find some rash or insect bite to explain it. What I saw wasn't a bite or a rash. It was a tiny, perfectly round bump on my skin. About the size of a pea, the bump sat there, right beneath my shoulder blade, flush with the surface. It was pink, slightly raised, and when I poked it, the itch flared intensely. I went to the doctor the next day. He looked at it, puzzled, but shrugged it off as a benign cyst. "If it doesn't go away in a few weeks, we'll take another look," he said. "It's probably nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. Over the next few days, the bump seemed to grow. I could feel it when I brushed my hand over the skin, a hard, round lump as if something foreign was nestled beneath the surface. The itch grew worse too, evolving into a constant, maddening burn that gnawed at me. I found myself scratching until my skin was raw, my fingers clawing at the bump as though I could dig it out. 3 weeks in, it wasn't just an itch anymore. The bump had grown to the size of a marble, and I could feel it pressing against my skin, harder, denser. The itch was no longer something I could ignore. It was a demand, consuming my every thought. It followed me to work, into meetings, into my dreams. It was as though it had burrowed into my mind, sinking roots into my consciousness. I made another appointment with the doctor, but it wasn't for another 2 weeks. I needed answers. I couldn't wait. By the 4th week, I stopped caring about appearances. I scratched my shoulder incessantly at work, at home, in public, tearing at the skin until it bled. Angela noticed, asking if I was okay. I lied and said it was an allergy, but the way she looked at me told me she didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it myself. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror again, staring at the lump on my shoulder. It was bigger now, too big to be a cyst. The skin around it was stretched taut, red and irritated from the constant scratching. I leaned in closer, squinting under the harsh bathroom light, and that's when I saw it. Something was moving beneath the skin. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my fingers against the lump, harder this time, and felt a slight, almost imperceptible squirming sensation, like something alive was writhing inside me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Panic surged through me. What the hell was happening? The itch intensified, spreading across my back and shoulders like wildfire. It wasn't just under the lump anymore. It was everywhere, crawling over my skin like 1,000 tiny legs. I scratched and scratched, but no amount of clawing could reach it. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The only thing that mattered was getting rid of that thing beneath my skin. Without thinking, I grabbed a pair of scissors from the bathroom drawer. My hands trembled as I pressed the tip of the blade against the swollen bump, gritting my teeth against the pain. I knew it was insane, but I didn't care anymore. I needed it out. I pressed harder, the blade piercing the skin. Blood welled up, but I barely felt it. The only thing I could focus on was the sensation, the horrible, squirming sensation beneath my fingers. With a sharp jerk, I dug the scissors in deeper, biting down on my lip to keep from screaming. The lump split open, and a rush of blood and pus spilled onto the sink. But that wasn't all. Something else has slid out too. A thin, translucent strand, no, a tendril emerged from the open wound, coiling and writhing in the air like a worm. I stared at it in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It moved on its own, twisting and curling like a living thing, as though it had been waiting for this moment to be freed. For a second, I couldn't move. I stood frozen, staring at the tendril hanging out of my shoulder, my body shaking with a sickening mix of horror and disbelief. And then it moved again, this time faster. The tendril shot back into the wound, burrowing deeper into my skin. I screamed, dropping the scissors, but it was too late. I could feel it moving now, not just in my shoulder, but inside me. The itch was back, stronger than ever, but it was no longer on the surface. It was deeper, crawling through my veins, slithering beneath my skin. I collapsed onto the floor, writhing in agony as the tendril moved through me, worming its way up my back, into my neck, down my arms. The itch was unbearable, a burning, searing need that no amount of scratching could satisfy. I could feel it in my muscles, in my bones, wriggling and twisting like a parasite. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew I was lying on the bathroom floor, the cold tiles slick with blood. I was still alive, barely, but the itch had subsided. The lump on my shoulder was gone, the skin around it a raw, gaping wound. But the relief was temporary. In the following days, I felt the tendril again, moving beneath the surface. It wasn't just in my shoulder anymore. It was spreading, like roots growing through my body, weaving through my organs, my limbs, my mind. And with it came the itch, that horrible, maddening itch that gnawed at me from the inside. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something had burrowed into me. Something alive. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering calls. I stayed in my apartment, locked away from the world, as the thing inside me grew. I could feel it, every second of every day, wriggling and squirming beneath my skin, twisting around my spine, crawling into my skull. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the itch, the constant, unrelenting itch. I scratched until my skin was raw, until my nails were caked with blood, but it never stopped. It was always there, burning and gnawing, driving me mad. One night, in a moment of sheer desperation, I grabbed a knife and started cutting again. This time, I didn't stop at my shoulder. I cut into my arms, my legs, anywhere I could feel the movement, trying to dig out the thing that was burrowing through me. But no matter how deep I cut, no matter how much blood I spilled, I couldn't reach it. I was losing my mind, I knew it, but I couldn't stop. And then one night I had a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I was standing in front of the mirror, staring at myself. My skin was pale, almost translucent, and beneath the surface I could see them, the tendrils. Hundreds of them, coiling and writhing beneath my flesh like worms in the soil. They pulsed and twisted, stretching through my body, feeding on me, consuming me. And then I heard a voice. "We are almost ready." I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The itch was still there, but something had changed. I could feel it. The tendrils were moving faster now, more urgent, as if they were preparing for something. The next morning, I noticed the lump again, this time on my neck. It was bigger than before, thicker, and it wasn't alone. Beyond the reflection. There's something inherently eerie about seeing yourself in a mirror. I used to think it was just the brain processing a reversed image, or maybe a mild unease at the idea of confronting one's imperfections, but now I know better. Now, I understand the real horror of mirrors. It all started a few months ago when I bought an old mirror at an estate sale. It wasn't anything spectacular, just an antique, brass-framed piece that looked like it had seen better days. I wasn't a collector of old things, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the intricacy of the frame, with little carvings of faces and hands stretching toward the glass. Or maybe it was just the price. Either way, I walked away with it, never suspecting what would happen next. The first time I noticed something was off, it was subtle. A flicker in the corner of my eye, like a shadow passing behind me. When I turned, there was nothing there. Just me, staring back at myself in the reflection. I chalked it up to fatigue. Work had been stressful, and I figured my mind was just playing tricks on me. A week passed, and the flickers became more frequent. I'd catch my reflection moving slightly when I wasn't. Sometimes it tilted its head a fraction of a second after I did, or blinked just a moment too late. It was disorienting, like watching a delayed video feed. But every time I questioned it, I convinced myself that I was overanalyzing. Things escalated quickly after that. I started hearing faint whispers whenever I stood in front of the mirror. They were too quiet to make out at first, just barely audible over the silence of my bedroom. But over time, they grew louder. I thought it might be an air draft or something vibrating in the walls, but no. The whispers were coming from the mirror. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, the whispers became unmistakable. My reflection was speaking. Its lips moved in sync with mine, but the words it uttered weren't mine. "He knows your thoughts. it said in a soft, menacing voice. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, toothbrush still in my hand, staring at the reflection as it stopped talking and returned to its usual mimicry. I ran out of the bathroom, heart racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to ignore it. How could I explain it? Mirrors don't talk, they don't move. I was probably just hallucinating from stress. But it didn't stop. Each night, the whispers became clearer. It said things about me, things no one else could know. Regrets, fears, secrets I hadn't shared with anyone. You can't escape yourself, Stephen. You know what you did. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear my reflection murmuring about things I hadn't even thought about in years. It reminded me of the time I betrayed a friend in high school, of the lie I told my boss just to get ahead at work. And every time it sounded more like me. The voice was softer, closer, and it echoed in my head long after I left the room. One night I covered the mirror with a sheet, hoping it would stop. It didn't. The whispers became more aggressive, and the reflection, my reflection, was no longer content just whispering. It began to move on its own. I'd catch it walking toward the glass as if trying to get out. Once I woke up to find the sheet had fallen to the floor, and there it was, standing still, smiling at me. A twisted, smug grin that I knew wasn't my own. I swear it winked at me before settling back into place when I blinked. Things spiraled out of control. The reflection no longer waited for me to be in the room. I'd come home from work and hear its voice echoing through the walls, its laughter filling my apartment. It taunted me, told me it was growing stronger, feeding off my fear. You're nothing without me, Stephen. You can't live without a reflection. I stopped looking in mirrors altogether. I smashed the bathroom mirror, avoided reflective surfaces, but it didn't help. The whispers followed me, and then, one night, as I stood in front of the cursed antique, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else, something alive, and it wanted out. That night, I heard the final whisper. I'm coming for you. I felt a sudden pull, like the air around me was collapsing inward, dragging me toward the mirror. My reflection was no longer mimicking me. It reached out from the glass, its hand pushing through the surface like water, gripping my wrist. I screamed, trying to pull away, but its grip was too strong. The last thing I remember was my reflection's face, twisted, triumphant, as it yanked me into the mirror. The world went dark, and when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in my apartment. I was inside the mirror. Now I can see it all. The world outside, my body moving around. But it's not me. It's him. The reflection is out there, living my life, wearing my face. No one seems to notice the difference. They smile, they laugh, they talk to him as if nothing's wrong. But I'm still here, trapped in the glass, watching helplessly as he lives the life that was once mine. I've always been obsessed with perception, the way our brains construct reality from the signals it receives. What we see isn't necessarily what's there, right? It's just our interpretation, a facsimile of the actual world, translated through flawed human senses. It started small, as these things often do. A flicker in the corner of my vision, like the air itself was unraveling. At first, I wrote it off as eye fatigue or one too many nights staring at my phone before bed. But then the flickers became more frequent, and they weren't just flickers anymore. They were tears, like something was pulling at the edges of the world, trying to peel it open. The first time it happened clearly, I was sitting in my living room watching TV. There was a commercial playing, one of those ads for laundry detergent, annoyingly bright and loud. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the TV screen was gone. No, not just the screen, the whole TV. It was as if someone had taken a giant eraser to the space where it used to be. My heart pounded and I rubbed my eyes, hoping to blink away whatever hallucination I was having. But when I looked again, it was still gone. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked over to the spot where the TV had been. My fingers brushed against the wall, and I swear I felt it give, just a little. Like the paint, the drywall, even the air was soft, malleable. And then, just as quickly as it disappeared, the TV was back, the commercial still blaring, the detergent still bubbling in impossibly clean clothes. I sank into my chair, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. After that, it got worse. I began to notice the tears everywhere, small at first, but growing wider, more frequent. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of them when I looked in the mirror, the corner of my reflection warping, as though the world behind me was slipping out of sync. Other times I'd see it in people, strangers on the street, their faces glitching, like a bad video game character whose model didn't load properly. I'd blink, and they'd return to normal, but the afterimage of their warped faces lingered in my mind. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was stress, a trick of the mind, but deep down I knew better. Something was happening, something real. One night I decided to confront it head on. I sat in the middle of my living room, the lights off, nothing but the hum of the refrigerator in the background. I focused, trying to will the tears into existence. I wanted to see them, really see them, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. And then, there it was, a tear, right in front of me, hovering in the air like a floating crack in a pane of glass. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before touching it. My fingers passed through the tear like it wasn't even there, and then, nothing. The tear vanished, and I was left sitting in the dark, my hand outstretched toward nothing. But that's when I felt it. Something watching me. Not a presence, not a shadow in the corner, but something deeper. It felt like the air had eyes, like the space around me was suddenly aware of me in a way that it hadn't been before. I jerked my hand back, my skin tingling, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. After that night, the tears weren't just something I saw. They were something I felt. They were everywhere, following me, creeping into every corner of my life. The ground beneath my feet sometimes felt less solid, like it might give way if I wasn't careful. The walls of my apartment seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. Then one day I saw myself glitch. I was washing my hands in the bathroom, staring into the mirror, when my reflection froze. I blinked. My hands kept moving, but the man in the mirror was stuck in place, his hands hovering under the faucet, droplets of water frozen mid-air. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass, and that's when I saw it. The tiniest tear, right in the middle of my face. It was barely visible, just a thin line running from my forehead to my chin, like a seam. I reached up, gingerly touching the spot on my real face, but there was nothing there, nothing I could feel anyway. The reflection, though, it was wrong. The tear began to widen, and as it did, my face started to come apart. It wasn't blood or bone underneath, but static, like the image of myself was breaking down, pixelating and distorting until I couldn't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. And then it was gone. The mirror was empty. No reflection, just a blank, shimmering surface. I stumbled back, my head spinning. I could feel it now. Everything around me was wrong. It wasn't real. Or maybe it was, but not in the way I'd always thought. The world wasn't solid, wasn't fixed. It was flexible, malleable, like a program that had started to break down, exposing the code beneath. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the empty mirror before I heard a sound behind me. It was soft at first, like static, but it grew louder, closer. I turned, expecting to see, something. But there was nothing there. Just my living room, the walls still, the furniture untouched. But the sound didn't stop. It was all around me now, a soft crackling, like the world itself was starting to peel away. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. And then, with a sudden deafening crack, the wall behind me gave way. Not like it crumbled or broke, but like it simply ceased to exist. I tumbled backward, falling into nothing. I don't know how long I fell. There was no up, no down, no sense of direction or space, just darkness, infinite and cold, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. and then I wasn't falling anymore. I was standing or floating, it was hard to tell, on a vast flat plain. There was nothing here. No walls, no sky, no ground. Just an endless expanse of nothingness. And yet, I wasn't alone. I felt it again. That presence, that awareness, only now it was stronger. It was all around me, inside me, as if the very fabric of this place was watching me, studying me. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure, or at least something resembling a figure, standing motionless in the void. I walked toward it, though every step felt like I was moving through molasses. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't a person at all. It was a reflection, my reflection. But not just any reflection. It was me, standing in my bathroom staring at the tear in my face. The frozen droplets of water were still suspended in the air, my hands still poised under the faucet. And then I realized this was where I was supposed to be. This was where the program had broken, where the glitch had started. I reached out, touching the reflection, and for a brief moment I felt everything snap back into place. The void vanished, the static disappeared, and I was whole again. I blinked, looking around my bathroom, everything perfectly normal. Except it wasn't. The tear in my face was still there, and now it wasn't just in the reflection. It was real, spreading, splitting me apart. I'm still here, still aware, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I can feel it now, the world rewriting itself, erasing me piece by piece. Soon there will be nothing left, just a glitch in the system. The stranger at the door. My name is Jason Miller, and I'm just an ordinary guy, a 36-year-old insurance adjuster living in Baltimore, Maryland. The job is steady, the city's alive with history, and my life is relatively routine. Or at least it was, until something happened last fall that still makes me double-check my locks every night. It was a Friday evening, late October, the start of that crisp time of year when the sun sets early and the chill sets in. I had just finished a long day of work and settled in at my row house in the Canton neighborhood. I wasn't expecting any company that night, so when the doorbell rang around 9 p.m., it startled me. At first, I thought it might be a delivery mistake or maybe a neighbor needing something. I walked over to the front door, flicked on the porch light, and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, debating whether I should open it or just walk away. I figured it was probably some kids messing around. Halloween was just a few days away, and pranks were typical this time of year. I opened the door slightly and looked out. My porch was empty, no one in sight. The street outside was quiet, lit by the dim glow of streetlights and lined with parked cars, all neatly tucked in for the night. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my couch, feeling a little foolish for being on edge. I put the incident out of my mind and turned on the TV to unwind. 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. This time, my heart jumped. I glanced at the clock. 9:23 p.m. I hadn't heard anyone approach, no footsteps, no sounds at all. I got up, walked cautiously to the door, and peered through the peephole once more. Again, no one was there. I opened the door a crack and looked out, scanning the street. It was still empty, not a soul in sight. But then I noticed something. Across the street, there was a figure standing in the shadows near a tree, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. Whoever it was stood perfectly still, facing my house. I shut the door quickly, my pulse racing. I told myself it was probably just someone from the neighborhood, maybe waiting for a ride or walking a dog that I hadn't seen. But something about the way they stood there, unmoving, made me uneasy. I went back to the couch, but now I was on high alert. The TV droned on, but I couldn't focus on it. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for the bell to ring again. It didn't. Instead, there was a soft knock. My skin crawled. Who knocks on a door after ringing the bell? I got up, but this time I didn't look through the peephole. I knew that whoever it was, they hadn't left. I could feel it. I stood frozen by the door, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate taps. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? There's a person standing outside not doing anything but knocking on my door? They'd think I was paranoid. Gathering my courage, I spoke through the door. "Who's there?" There was no response, just silence. I knocked on the door myself, hoping it would startle them. "Hey, what do you want?" Again, nothing. But then, after a few seconds, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Let me in." I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I knew no one was supposed to be at my house. No deliveries, no visitors. No one had called or texted me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I decided not to open it this time. Then, without warning, my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Let me in." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The message came through at the exact moment the whispering had stopped. How had this person gotten my number? I bolted upstairs, needing distance from the door, from whatever was out there. As I paced in my bedroom, trying to think logically, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "You're not safe." My stomach dropped. I wanted to call the police, but fear paralyzed me. What if this was just some elaborate prank? I paced the room, my mind racing, until I noticed something strange. The house next door, usually dark this time of night, had a single light on in the upstairs window. I hadn't seen my neighbor in a while. She traveled a lot for work. But someone was there, and the light was enough to give me a slight sense of comfort. Before I could think it through, I grabbed my phone and walked downstairs, determined to make a run for it and head to my neighbor's house. Whatever was happening outside my door wasn't normal. But as I reached the front hallway, I heard something. Breathing. It was soft but distinct, coming from the other side of the door. Slow, deliberate breaths, almost as if someone was standing right on the other side, waiting for me. I slowly backed away, my hands shaking. My phone buzzed again. "I see you." That's when I snapped. I called the police. When they arrived about 10 minutes later, they found no one outside. They walked the street, checked my porch, even knocked on a few neighbors' doors. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I showed them the texts, but the number was untraceable. A burner phone, most likely. They told me it was probably someone messing with me, and that I should stay inside, lock the doors, and call again if anything strange happened. I thanked them and locked up, but I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, lights on, watching the door. The next morning, I decided to leave the house for a while, maybe stay with a friend. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Etched lightly into the wood of my doorframe, right where the person had been knocking, were 2 words. "Let me in." I stared at the message, unsettled but determined not to jump to conclusions. It could have been done by anyone, kids messing around, or someone trying to play a sick joke. Still, it rattled me. I took a photo of the carving, unsure of what I planned to do with it, and then went inside. I called a locksmith the next morning. I didn't mention the "let me in" scratched into the door frame because it felt absurd to talk about. What would they think? Instead, I just asked for better locks. They replaced the deadbolt with something more secure and added an extra latch inside. I felt more at ease, telling myself it was just some creep trying to mess with me. A couple of weeks went by and nothing happened. Life moved forward. I didn't get any more strange texts. No one rang my doorbell late at night. And there were no more strange figures standing outside my house. Things returned to normal, and I convinced myself the whole incident was just someone pulling a prank. One evening, a few months later, I bumped into my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Reeves, while taking out the trash. She was a kind woman in her late 60s who had lived on the block for decades. As we chatted, I casually mentioned the strange events from that night. Her face darkened, and she frowned. "You know, you're not the first person in the neighborhood to experience something like that," she said. "Back in the 90s, the Johnsons, 2 houses down, had a similar thing happen. They'd hear knocks at night, find strange messages, and once they even saw a man standing across the street just watching. He never approached, never said a word, but they'd find messages etched into their doorframe too. They eventually reported it to the police, but nothing ever came of it. The guy just disappeared. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Did they ever find out who it was? Nope, she said. It just stopped. But they moved not long after. Her words stayed with me as I went back inside. I hadn't thought about moving before, and part of me refused to let some random person scare me out of my own home. But the other part of me, the part that now double-checked my locks every night, couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened back then might have circled back. Nothing ever happened again, at least not in the way it did that night. Life returned to its usual rhythm, and the strange events slowly faded from my mind. Sometimes, though, when I walk by the door, I catch myself glancing at the faint marks on the frame. I never sanded them off or painted over them. I probably should. But somehow, they remind me to be careful, to pay attention. It's been almost a year now, and while I don't think about it as often, that night changed the way I see the world, or at least how I see my place in it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe something we'll never fully understand, but either way, I take no chances these days, and I still haven't answered the door after dark. Silent Streets of Chicago. My name is Alex Parker, a 32-year-old software engineer living in Chicago. I've always considered myself an average guy. Steady job, a small circle of friends, and a modest apartment in Lincoln Park. It was late December and the city was cloaked in a thick blanket of snow. The holiday season was in full swing, but I was spending it alone. My family lived out of state, and work had me tied down. One Friday evening, after wrapping up a project, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The streets were unusually quiet, the snowfall muffling the usual sounds of the city. Streetlights cast an amber glow on the fresh snow, and the cold air was invigorating. I walked aimlessly for about an hour, eventually finding myself in a part of the neighborhood I didn't recognize. The buildings here were older, with iron fire escapes and ornate facades that hinted at a bygone era. As I turned down a narrow side street, I noticed a small cafe tucked between two apartment buildings. Its sign read, "Midnight Roast," and warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk. Feeling the chill, I decided to step inside for a cup of coffee. The interior was cozy but sparsely populated, just a few patrons scattered at tables and a barista behind the counter. Soft jazz played in the background. I ordered a black coffee and took a seat by the window. As I sipped my drink, I couldn't help but feel that something was off. The conversations around me were hushed, and the other customers seemed to glance my way more often than normal. After a few minutes, a man entered the cafe and sat at a table across from me. He was middle-aged, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He caught my gaze and gave a slight nod. Unnerved, I looked away. I finished my coffee and decided to head home. As I stood up, the man spoke. "Cold night for a walk," he said. "Yeah, but the snow's beautiful," I replied politely. He smiled faintly. "Be careful out there." "Thanks," I said and left the cafe. Outside, the snowfall had intensified. I realized I wasn't entirely sure how to get back to my apartment from here. Pulling out my phone, I saw that the battery was nearly dead, a common issue in the cold. Before I could open my Maps app, the screen went black. Great. I decided to retrace my steps, but the streets looked different somehow. Landmarks I thought I recognized were nowhere to be seen. The quiet now felt oppressive. As I walked, I sensed someone was following me. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the man from the cafe about half a block behind. Maybe he lived nearby, I thought. I picked up my pace. After a few minutes, I looked back again. He was closer, his breath visible in the cold air. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I turned down another street, hoping to lose him, but the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow persisted. Panic began to set in. I spotted a convenience store up ahead, a beacon of light in the darkness. I hurried inside, the bell above the door jingling loudly. The clerk looked up from his magazine. "Evening," he said. "Evening," I replied, trying to steady my voice. I pretended to browse the aisles, occasionally peeking out the window. The man stood across the street, staring directly at the store. "Is everything okay?" the clerk asked. "That man out there," I whispered. "He's been following me." The clerk glanced outside. "I don't see anyone." I looked again. The sidewalk was empty. "Maybe he left," I muttered, feeling foolish. "Need me to call someone?" the clerk offered. "No, it's fine, thanks." I purchased a pack of gum to justify my presence and stepped back outside. The street was deserted. I decided to head in the direction I hoped would lead me home. After several blocks, I began to recognize my surroundings. Relief washed over me as I spotted the familiar awning of a local deli near my apartment. "Almost there," I told myself. Just then, a figure emerged from an alleyway ahead. The same man. He stood motionless, blocking my path. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice echoing. He didn't respond. I weighed my options. Turning back didn't seem wise, and crossing the street might provoke him. Summoning my courage, I continued walking, keeping a safe distance. As I passed, he spoke softly. "You should have stayed home tonight." I stopped. "Why are you following me?" He sighed. "It's not safe out here." I noticed then that his gaze wasn't threatening. It was somber. "Look," I said, "if you're trying to scare me, it's working. Please leave me alone." He shook his head. "You don't understand." Before I could reply, a loud crash sounded behind me. I spun around to see a car skidding on the icy street, heading straight for me. Time seemed to slow. I felt a force push me backward as the car slammed into a parked vehicle where I'd been standing moments before. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. Dazed, I looked up to see the driver stumbling out, checking the damage. "Are you okay?" the man from the cafe asked, kneeling beside me. You saved me," I stammered. He offered his hand and helped me up. "I tried to warn you." "How did you know?" He gave a faint smile. "Let's just say I had a feeling." Before I could ask more, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The driver apologized profusely, but I assured him I was unhurt. As the police arrived to assess the accident, I scanned the area, but the man was gone. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the encounter. I returned to the spot where the cafe had been, but there was no sign of it. Just a closed storefront with a "for lease" sign. I asked around, but no one knew of any cafe called Midnight Roast. Perplexed, I searched online but found nothing. It was as if the place, and the man, never existed. I considered the possibility that I imagined it all, but the memory was too vivid. And the fact remained, if he hadn't pulled me out of the way, I might not be here. Weeks later, I was browsing a used bookstore when a photograph fell out from between two books. It was an old picture of a group of people standing in front of a building, the same building where I'd found the cafe. Among them was the man who had saved me. I showed the photo to the shop owner. "Do you know who this is?" He adjusted his glasses. "Ah, that's a photo from the 1950s. That building used to house a cafe popular with night owls, closed down decades ago. Do you know any of the people in the photo?" He pointed to the man. "That's Thomas Gray. He was known for helping folks in need. Died in a car accident while saving a pedestrian." A chill ran down my spine. "Did he have any family?" I asked. "Not that I recall." "Why do you ask?" I shook my head. "No reason, just curious." I left the store, the photo clutched in my hand. I don't have an explanation for what happened that night. Maybe I was saved by a guardian angel, or perhaps some mysteries are beyond understanding. All I know is that sometimes the quiet streets of Chicago hold secrets, glimpses into moments where the past and present intertwine in ways we can't explain. Since that night, I pay more attention to the world around me. I walk those streets with a newfound respect, aware that there are forces at play we may never fully grasp. If you find yourself out late in the silent city, keep your eyes open. You never know who might be watching or looking out for you. The Missing Tenants of Philadelphia. My name is Ryan Thompson, and I manage several properties in and around Philadelphia. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and I'm used to dealing with strange tenants and occasional odd circumstances. But last year, I dealt with a situation that I still can't fully explain, and it still haunts me every time I get a new tenant inquiry. It started with a small brownstone in Rittenhouse Square. The place was charming, 3 stories, ivy climbing the exterior walls, and large bay windows overlooking the quiet, tree-lined street. It was a prime piece of real estate, the kind of property that never stayed vacant for long. I had rented it out to a young couple, Matt and Julie Palmer. They were nice people, quiet, polite, paid their rent on time, no complaints. They'd moved in at the beginning of spring, eager to start fresh in the city. They didn't have kids, and Matt worked from home while Julie was studying for her master's. The perfect tenants, or so I thought. 2 months after they moved in, I got a call from one of the neighbors, a man named Jim who lived in the brownstone next door. He was concerned because he hadn't seen the Palmers in over a week. He said their car hadn't moved, no lights had been on in the house, and their mail was piling up. Normally, I wouldn't think too much of it. People go on vacation, they visit family, but something about the tone of Jim's voice put me on edge. I decided to check it out myself. I called the Palmers, but both of their phones went straight to voicemail. I texted, but got no response. A little irritated, but figuring they'd probably just forgotten to tell me about a trip, I drove over to the property the next day. When I arrived, the house looked normal. The lawn was well kept, no signs of forced entry or anything suspicious from the outside. But when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I had a spare key, so I let myself in to take a look around, thinking maybe they'd left for a last-minute vacation and just hadn't informed anyone. As soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was stale, heavy, the kind of feeling you get when a house has been shut up for a long time. It was quiet, too quiet. The lights were off, and even though it was early afternoon, the house felt unnaturally dark. I called out their names. Matt? Julie? My voice echoed back to me in the empty hallway. No answer. I moved from room to room, trying not to feel too much like an intruder. The living room was tidy, their books still on the shelves, and their coffee cups were left on the table. It looked like they'd been there recently, but there was no sign of anyone. I went upstairs to the bedrooms. The bed was unmade, clothes tossed casually on a chair like someone had been there that morning. But again, no sign of Matt or Julie. Then I noticed something strange. In the hallway upstairs, the closet door was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it, and I didn't remember it being open when I walked up. My heart began to pound in my chest, but I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I opened the closet fully, expecting nothing more than extra coats or storage, but inside was something I hadn't expected. A small folded piece of paper tucked behind a stack of blankets. It wasn't hidden really, but it seemed like someone had placed it there intentionally. I unfolded the paper and found a single sentence scrawled hastily across the page. Don't trust the basement. My skin prickled as I read it, and a cold sweat broke out on my neck. The note wasn't signed, and I had no idea if Matt or Julie had written it. But why would they leave something like that behind? Against my better judgment, I made my way to the basement. The house was old, and the basement had always been a bit creepy. Stone walls, dim lighting, that slightly damp, earthy smell. But now, as I descended the narrow staircase, the feeling of dread grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement was just as I remembered, filled with old furniture, boxes, and other storage. I looked around, shining my phone flashlight into the darker corners, trying to see what could be so alarming about this space. Then I saw it. On the far wall, near the foundation, there was a section where the wall didn't quite match the rest. It was newer, the bricks a different shade, like someone had done some recent work. But as far as I knew, no renovations had been done to the basement since before the Palmers moved in. I walked closer, inspecting the bricks. They seemed solid enough, but something didn't sit right. I tapped on the wall, and it sounded hollow behind the bricks. Not the kind of hollow that comes from a normal wall cavity, but as if there was a space behind it. A room. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would anyone have bricked up a section of the basement? And why hadn't I noticed it before? I didn't stay long after that. I left the basement and quickly locked up the house, telling myself I'd come back with someone to help me inspect it later. I called the police, filed a missing persons report for Matt and Julie, and did everything by the book. But no one could find any trace of them. Days passed and the police searched the house, finding nothing unusual except for the same bricked-up wall I'd noticed. They told me it was likely from an old remodel, nothing to worry about. But that didn't explain the note. Months went by, and eventually the case went cold. No leads, no sightings of Matt or Julie. The house remained empty. Then, a few weeks ago, I got a call from another neighbor, someone who had just moved into the brownstone next door. They said they'd seen a man standing in the Palmer's window late at night, a man who fit Matt's description. When they tried to call out to him, the figure disappeared into the house. I've been avoiding that property ever since. I still manage it technically, but I refuse to go inside alone. I can't explain what happened to the Palmers, and no one seems to have any answers. All I know is that there are some places you just shouldn't go digging too deep into, especially in old houses like that one. I keep telling myself there's a logical explanation, but every time I think about that bricked-up wall in the basement, I get the same feeling I had that day, that some things are better left alone. The house is still vacant. I've had no serious offers since the Palmers disappeared, and every now and then when I drive past it, I swear I can see a shadow moving in one of the upstairs windows. Maybe it's just the light playing tricks, or maybe they never really left. The Beacons of Endless Dark. I've worked as a Coast Guard officer for 12 years now, and in that time I've seen things that would unsettle even the most hardened sailors. Wrecked ships, bodies claimed by the sea, mysterious flares in the night sky. But nothing could have prepared me for the night the lighthouses started appearing. It was a Thursday late into October when we first noticed something odd off the coast. I was on the night shift at Station 29, a small, isolated outpost that overlooks a stretch of the North Atlantic. Our radar picked up something strange, lights blinking on and off right on the horizon. At first, we thought it was just a cargo ship. They're common in that area, moving silently across the water with their safety lights blinking. But these lights were different. There were 3 of them, positioned in a perfect triangle, and they weren't moving. They stayed completely still, pulsing softly in the darkness. Our first instinct was to call it in. We tried contacting the nearest maritime authorities, but our radio equipment was acting up, static and interference, which wasn't unusual during the colder months. I radioed our base anyway, but there was no response. Probably just a ship, my partner Greg said, glancing out at the distant lights. They'll move eventually. Maybe they're anchored. But the hours dragged on, and the lights didn't move. They didn't even flicker, just blinked, steady as a heartbeat. By midnight, I was restless. The fog had started to roll in, thick and heavy, obscuring the ocean's surface. But even through the dense fog, the lights remained, brighter now, as though they were pushing through the mist itself. "We should go check it out," I finally said, the unease gnawing at me. Greg raised an eyebrow. "You want to take the boat out into that?" He gestured to the fog, which was growing thicker by the minute. "It'll be a fool's errand. We won't see a damn thing." But something about those lights unsettled me, like they didn't belong there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I insisted, and after some grumbling, Greg agreed. We grabbed our gear, and within minutes we were on the water, the small patrol boat cutting through the waves. The fog enveloped us almost immediately, turning everything into a blank canvas of gray. It was disorienting, even for seasoned sailors like us. The only thing guiding us were the distant lights, still pulsing faintly in the mist. "Could be a rogue buoy," Greg muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "No buoy lights like that," I said, shaking my head. As we drew closer, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the source of the lights. What I saw sent a chill through my bones. There, rising from the water, were 3 lighthouses, massive structures towering far higher than any lighthouse should, with weathered stone and rusted metal railings. They were old, ancient even, yet their lights were impossibly bright, piercing through the fog with mechanical precision. Each lighthouse was identical, standing in a perfect triangle formation, as if guarding something in the center. "Lighthouses?" Greg whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "There's no record of any lighthouses out here. None. Not in any of the charts." I scanned my memory too. He was right. This stretch of coastline had no structures, no islands, no rocks that would warrant them. Yet here they were, towering over the sea, ominous and silent. As we drew closer, the boat's engine sputtered, then died completely. Greg and I exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't the first time equipment had failed in the fog, but this felt different. The air was heavy, almost oppressive. My skin prickled like we were being watched. We drifted, the current carrying us slowly toward the nearest lighthouse. The closer we got, the more I could see the details of the stonework. Intricate carvings etched into the walls, almost like runes, though I couldn't decipher them. They looked ancient, older than any lighthouse I'd ever seen. The light from the beacon overhead spun slowly, rhythmically, bathing the fog in waves of light and shadow. Suddenly, something in the water caught my eye. A ripple, a flash of movement beneath the surface. Greg saw it too. "What the hell is that?" The water, once calm, began to stir. The ripples grew larger, more violent, as if something huge was moving beneath us. My heart raced and I grabbed the boat's oar, preparing for whatever might happen next. But then, as quickly as the water had stirred, it stilled again. Silence. No waves. No sound. Just the eerie, constant turning of the lighthouse beacons. "We need to get out of here," Greg said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." I nodded, my hands shaking as I tried to restart the engine. Nothing. The boat stayed still, bobbing in the water like a toy in a bathtub. Then, without warning, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't coming from the boat, it was coming from the lighthouses. A deep, vibrating sound, like the drone of an enormous machine powering up. I looked up and that's when I saw it. In the space between the lighthouses, where the ocean should have stretched endlessly, the water had begun to sink. Slowly, the sea itself was receding, pulling downward as though it were being drained. In its place was an opening, a black yawning void in the water growing larger by the second. "What is that?" Greg whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Before I could respond, the hum intensified. The lighthouse's lights began to flicker, then strobe, faster and faster. The water continued to fall away, revealing a cavernous space beneath the ocean. The sight of it was impossible. There was no bottom, just darkness. A pit, stretching deep into the earth, swallowing everything. I tried the radio again, my hands shaking. "Mayday, mayday. This is Station 29. We need immediate..." Static. Just static. Greg was backing away from the edge of the boat, his face pale. "We need to jump," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of the water before..." But it was too late. From the depths of the black pit, something began to rise. At first, it was just a shape, vague, indistinct. But as it emerged from the darkness, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't a single thing, but many. A mass of writhing, pale limbs, intertwined and moving as one. Dozens, no, hundreds of figures, rising from the pit, their bodies slick with water, their faces blank and featureless. They crawled, impossibly tall and thin, their elongated arms reaching toward the boat. The humming grew louder, more deafening, as the figures pulled themselves free of the blackness. I could see them now, clearly, twisted human-like forms, yet utterly alien, their limbs too long, their movements too smooth, their heads turned in unison, as if they could sense us, though they had no eyes. Greg was screaming now, but I couldn't hear him over the hum. One of the figures reached the boat, its hand, if you could call it that, stretching out and brushing the side of the hull. I yanked the oar, trying to push it away, but its grip was cold, wet, and unyielding. The others were following, more of them crawling from the pit, their limbs slipping and sliding over each other. They moved as one, a mass of bodies climbing toward the light of the lighthouses. And then they stopped. The humming ceased. The figures, inches from the boat, froze in place, their heads tilted as if listening. The lights from the lighthouses blinked off. Total darkness. For a moment, the world was silent. Then, in the distance, a new light appeared. Not from the lighthouses, but from beneath the water, deep within the pit. A soft, glowing blue, like the light of some forgotten star. The figures turned, drawn to the light. They began to move again, not toward us, but back into the pit, retreating into the blackness from which they had come. Slowly they disappeared, one by one, until only the glow remained. And then, without warning, the lighthouses blinked back on, their beacons sweeping over the ocean, as if nothing had happened. The water returned to normal, the void in the ocean sealing itself as if it had never been there. Greg and I sat in stunned silence, the boat rocking gently beneath us. I don't know how long we sat there watching the lighthouses pulse rhythmically like they always had. But I knew one thing for certain. Those lighthouses were not meant to guide ships. They were meant to guard something else. The frequencies we cannot hear. The nights are the quietest. Working late in the studio after everyone's gone, there's nothing but the soft hum of machinery and the occasional creak of the old building to keep me company. I always enjoyed this part, the solitude of it. Sound engineers like me thrive in the silence, where every subtle noise becomes a universe unto itself. But there was something different about this night, something I couldn't quite place at first. It started with a recording I didn't recognize, sitting in the inbox of my work email. I don't usually open unsolicited files, common practice, but the subject line caught my eye. You won't hear it. Curiosity got the better of me. I downloaded the file and loaded it into the sound software. It was just over 2 minutes long, but the waveform was odd. Most sounds create spikes and valleys, chaotic, but with patterns. Human voices, instruments, ambient noise. But this was smooth, eerily smooth, as if someone had recorded pure silence. I hit play. At first, nothing, just the same hum of the studio around me. I watched the playhead move across the track, waiting for something, anything. Then, about 30 seconds in, I felt it. A pressure in my skull, like my head was slowly being squeezed in a vice. It wasn't a sound in the traditional sense, nothing I could pinpoint with my ears, but I could feel it deep in my bones. I stopped the track, my hand trembling. The pressure disappeared instantly. My first thought was that it might be a high-pitched frequency, something outside the range of normal hearing. I adjusted the levels, boosting the higher frequencies, and hit play again. This time, the sensation came quicker. 30 seconds in, and there it was, an almost imperceptible tone, just above the range of what I could consciously process. It wasn't the kind of tone that would make your ears ring, but it made my teeth itch, set my nerves on edge. My vision blurred for a moment as though my brain was struggling to make sense of something it couldn't comprehend. I paused the recording. The sensation faded, leaving me in the familiar hum of the studio. What the hell was this? I pulled up the metadata on the file, but there was nothing. No name, no timestamp, no origin. Just a file called track1.wave. It didn't even have a sender. The email was blank, no address, no signature. I tried replaying it several times, each time stopping when the pressure became too much. It felt like standing too close to an invisible wall that was gradually closing in on me. I stepped away from the desk, shaking my head. This wasn't possible. It had to be a prank, some elaborate hoax. But then the hallucinations started. The first one was subtle. As I was packing up to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing in the shadowed corner of the room. My heart jumped, and I spun around, but nothing was there. Just the empty space where the sound booth stood. I laughed it off, chalking it up to fatigue. It was late, after all, and I'd been staring at screens for hours. But the feeling of being watched lingered as I made my way out of the building. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, and the further I got from the studio, the more my chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. The next day, I couldn't get the sound out of my head. It wasn't a melody or a hum, but more like a presence. It gnawed at me, pulling my thoughts back to the recording. Against my better judgment, I returned to the studio that night and loaded the file again. This time I had an idea. I hooked up an oscilloscope to the sound system, hoping to visually interpret whatever frequency was buried in the track. The results made no sense. The frequency registered far below anything that should have been audible to the human ear, somewhere around 19 Hz infrasound. That's when it hit me. Infrasound is known to cause feelings of unease, even hallucinations in some cases. But this was different. It wasn't just discomfort. It felt like something was trying to push through the barrier of reality itself, like the sound was a key trying to unlock some door in my mind. I sat there for hours replaying the track in different variations, tweaking the levels, amplifying the tone. And then, at exactly 2 minutes and 15 seconds into the track, something happened that made my blood run cold. The waveform changed. It spiked sharply, and a low voice, raspy and garbled, whispered, "Can you hear us now?" I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. The voice wasn't from the recording. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Yet the air was heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. It was as though the very fabric of the room had shifted, subtly, just beyond the edge of perception. I slammed the laptop shut and bolted from the studio, my skin crawling with the sensation that I was no longer alone. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I scoured the internet for anything remotely similar, any mention of anomalous sounds or untraceable recordings. Most of what I found was pseudoscience, conspiracy theories about government experiments with infrasound or lost radio signals. None of it seemed credible, but it was all I had. The hallucinations grew worse. I started seeing things in the periphery, shapes, shadows, things that vanished the moment I turned to look at them, but they felt real. And that's what terrified me the most. The line between reality and whatever this was blurred more and more each day. I didn't know how to make it stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tone. That deep, low hum reverberated through my skull like a tuning fork being struck over and over again. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, a pressure, pushing, always pushing. I decided to confront it, to let the recording play all the way through. Maybe it would give me some kind of answer, or at least some closure. Maybe it would stop. I returned to the studio, now a place of dread rather than comfort. The building was quiet as usual. I sat down, plugged in my headphones, and took a deep breath. I opened the file. The pressure came instantly this time. My teeth ground together as I let the sound wash over me. The room seemed to pulse in time with the frequency. 30 seconds in, the first hallucination hit. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness, watching. But I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the screen. At 1 minute, the walls started to breathe. They flexed and expanded like the lungs of some massive creature. I could feel its breath, hot and fetid, on the back of my neck. 2 minutes. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The figure moved closer, but I still didn't look. My heart pounded, each beat syncing with the rhythmic pulse of the tone. Then, at 2 minutes and 15 seconds, the voice returned. This time it was clearer. You're almost there. My fingers hovered over the stop button. Every instinct screamed for me to shut it off. But I couldn't. I had to know. What was this sound? What was trying to get through? The tone intensified, rising in pitch and pressure until it felt like my skull would split open. And then, without warning, it stopped. Silence. A silence so deep it swallowed everything. I ripped off the headphones, gasping for breath, but the silence remained. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an absence of everything. The world itself felt muted, like I'd been cut off from reality. And that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't a hallucination anymore. It was standing right in front of me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blur of shifting, distorted features. Its form flickered like a bad signal, stuttering in and out of existence. It leaned in close, whispering words I couldn't understand, a language not meant for human ears. Then, with a jolt, the silence broke. The building creaked, the hum of machinery returned, and the figure was gone. I don't know what I unleashed that night. But I do know one thing. The sound wasn't just a recording. It was a door. And I opened it. The stain. It was just a stain. That's what I told myself the first time I noticed it on my ceiling. A faint, dark mark, roughly the size of a hand, nestled in the corner of the room where the light didn't quite reach. The kind of stain you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it. Maybe it had always been there, a harmless blotch from a long-forgotten water leak, or a shadow cast by the angle of the light. I never thought much about it, not at first, but soon it became impossible to ignore. I had just moved into the apartment a month ago, a quiet one-bedroom in a crumbling building on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but the rent was cheap, and I needed a place to start over after everything fell apart back home. I thought the isolation might be good for me. The first night I noticed the stain, I had been tossing and turning in bed. Sleeplessness had become a regular companion ever since I moved in. The neighborhood was quiet enough, but there was something off about the silence. It wasn't peaceful, it felt thick, oppressive, like the silence was sitting on my chest, suffocating me. That night, as I stared up at the ceiling, I noticed the stain for the first time. A small, dark spot in the corner. It was strange. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before. I sat up staring at it for a long time, trying to figure out where it came from. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the stain was bigger. Not by much, just a few inches wider, but I could tell it had grown. Now, instead of a vague smudge, it looked more defined, almost like it was spreading. I told myself it must have been my imagination, that I hadn't really been paying attention the night before. Maybe I just hadn't noticed how large it was to begin with. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. Days passed, and the stain continued to grow. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings like this had leaky pipes, and water damage was inevitable. It was probably just a mold spot that no one had bothered to fix. But as the days stretched into weeks, the stain spread faster. What had started as a small dark patch now stretched across the ceiling above my bed. A web of black tendrils that seemed to be creeping down toward me, slow but deliberate. I contacted the landlord, of course, left voicemails, sent emails, no response. When I finally went to the office in person, the door was locked, and a handwritten sign on the window read, "Closed for renovations." I asked the neighbors, but most of them avoided my gaze when I brought up the building's maintenance. A few told me they hadn't seen the landlord in weeks. Some had never seen him at all. "He's probably out of town," one neighbor shrugged. "That's what he does. He just disappears for a while and comes back whenever he feels like it." The stain continued to grow. I tried everything to remove it, scrubbing it with bleach, painting over it, even scraping the ceiling with a knife. Nothing worked. No matter what I did, the stain remained, dark and slick, like it had been burned into the very structure of the building. And the worst part? It was starting to look like something. At night, when I stared at it for too long, the edges of the stain seemed to shift, as if it was moving ever so slightly, like the ripples of oil on water. It looked like fingers. Long, bony fingers stretching out from the corners of the room, reaching down toward me while I slept. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a result of my growing paranoia and sleep deprivation. But every morning the stain was a little bigger, a little darker, a little closer. I began to feel like I wasn't alone in my apartment. The air felt different, thicker somehow, charged with a static energy that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting in places where there shouldn't be any. And that smell, the sour, metallic stench of damp rot that seemed to cling to everything, no matter how much I cleaned. It got worse at night. Every time I turned off the lights, I could feel it, watching. The stain wasn't just a stain anymore. It was something more. I could sense its presence, lurking just above me, waiting for the moment when I would finally succumb to sleep. My dreams became a twisted reflection of my waking fears. In them, I was trapped in the apartment, unable to leave, while the stain grew and grew, its black tendrils creeping down the walls, curling around my limbs, dragging me toward it. I started sleeping with the lights on. One night around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching. At first I thought it was coming from the walls, rats maybe, or something in the pipes. But as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was coming from the ceiling, from the stain. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was filled with that thick, oppressive silence again, but the scratching continued, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from directly above me, from the center of the stain. I stared at it, frozen, watching as the dark shape shifted, writhing like something alive. And then I saw it. The center of the stain bulged, the surface bubbling like tar, and something pushed through. Just for a moment I saw it. A finger, thin, black, and impossibly long, reaching out from the stain like a spider's leg, curling and uncurling in the air before retreating back into the ceiling. I screamed and bolted out of bed, my mind racing. What was that? Was I losing my mind? Had I really just seen a hand emerge from my ceiling? I spent the rest of the night in my bathroom, the only room without a direct line of sight to the stain. I locked the door and sat on the cold tile floor, trying to convince myself that I was hallucinating, that it was all in my head. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I noticed something even more disturbing. The stain had stopped growing. Instead, it had started to drip. Dark, oily droplets were falling from the edges of the stain, hitting the floor with a soft, rhythmic tap. The liquid was thick, black, and smelled like something rotting deep beneath the earth. I grabbed a bucket, trying to catch the drops before they soaked into the floor, but no matter how much I cleaned, the dripping wouldn't stop. It just kept coming, like the ceiling itself was bleeding. I couldn't stay there anymore, I knew that. But where could I go? The landlord wasn't responding. My friends had stopped taking my calls. They thought I was paranoid, losing it. And maybe I was. But I couldn't deny what I had seen. The stain was alive, and whatever it was, it wanted something from me. That night, I made the mistake of staying. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, pack up whatever I could and find another place, anywhere but there. But that night, as I lay awake in bed, I felt the room change. The air grew colder, the silence thickened, and then I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, insistent, like nails being dragged across wood. I sat up, heart hammering, and looked toward the stain. It was moving. The black shape writhed and twisted, the edges pulsating like a living organism. And then, without warning, the ceiling cracked. A jagged line split the plaster, right down the center of the stain. From the crack, That same oily black liquid began to pour out, faster this time, like a flood. It splattered onto the floor, thick and foul-smelling, soaking everything in its path. But that wasn't the worst part. From the crack, something began to emerge. First, a hand, long skeletal fingers covered in the same black sludge, clawing at the air. Then an arm, followed by another. Slowly, impossibly, a figure pulled itself out of the ceiling. It was humanoid, but twisted, grotesque, its body covered in that dark, dripping substance. Its limbs were too long, its head too large, and its eyes, empty, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just watched in paralyzed horror as the thing crawled out of the stain, its body contorting in unnatural ways. It dropped to the floor with a wet, slapping sound, its limbs splayed out at odd angles. For a moment it just lay there, twitching as if it was adjusting to the world outside the stain. Then slowly it lifted its head. Those empty eyes locked onto mine, and it smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide across its face. Its teeth, jagged, sharp, like broken glass, glistened in the dim light. It began to crawl toward me, its limbs bending and snapping as it moved, dragging itself across the floor, leaving a trail of black sludge in its wake. I stumbled out of bed, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The thing was getting closer, its grin widening, its fingers reaching out, stretching toward me. I backed into the corner of the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Just as the thing was about to reach me, I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted for the door. I didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran. Out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the city. I never went back to that apartment. I don't know what it was or why it chose me. All I know is that the stain wasn't just a stain. It was a doorway, a crack between worlds, and something else was living on the other side. Sometimes late at night I can still hear the sound of dripping, faint but unmistakable, like a steady tap of liquid hitting the floor. And when I close my eyes, I can see that smile. That terrible, twisted smile. I've learned to live with it. But every time I see a stain on the ceiling, no matter how small, I feel that same creeping dread. Because I know it's waiting. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark. I hope these tales left you with more than just a chill down your spine. If you made it through all the stories, let me know in the comments which one lingered with you the most. And if you haven't already, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you're always the first to know when new stories come to life. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, the darkness is always closer than it seems.